Good morning, everyone. Well, we'll pick up this week where we ended last week with this question we were looking at, and I think we might have answered the first part of it. But our question was, what are some of the major differences between the two returns from Babylonian captivity recorded in the book? I think we did look at the numbers, the difference in the numbers. Remember, the group that went back with Zerubbabel were 42,360 Jewish captives, along with their servants, which was roughly a little over 7,000, I think, 7,337 servants. And then with Ezra, though, we saw that there was roughly 2,000 that went back with him. And we did look at the warnings that Isaiah and Jeremiah both gave to the yet-to-be exiled nation. Before they were exiled, remember Isaiah and Jeremiah, both of them warned Israel that when the time came, they were to flee Babylon. They were to leave. And we kind of touched on some thoughts of maybe why the two returns were that great of difference in numbers, but as we said, that's what we're told. So when we reason, we need to be careful of our reasoning. But one thing, I don't know if anybody, before I say what I saw, did anyone else have any thoughts on what they saw was different in the exiles? Gord?
This might just be a question. The first group that went back, the first remnants, did they have any sort of leadership with them? Like the second one went back with Ezra, and Ezra was kind of like a leader.
Oh, so you're saying, did they have any type of leadership?
Yeah, like prophets or king, or
well,
to keep them out of trouble, because obviously they didn't stay out of trouble very long.
Well, no. But sometimes, see, with Israel, they could have had 100 prophets with them, and they were still going to get in trouble. Well, though, that's a good question. We notice in, our first one was chapter 2, those that were turning. There was all the heads of the tribes, like the elder men. There was priests and Levites that went back in that first group. Actually, I think, if anything, maybe there might have been more leadership in the first group as opposed to just Ezra in the second group. But of course, like you say, we see actually in verse 70 of chapter 2, we're told there the priests and the Levites, some of the people, and then all those that were taking service in the temple, the singers, gatekeepers, temple servants. My thought is, there was maybe Jeremy?
There was a Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, who was one of the main ones that we read of by name. The Levites would have been leading in the priestly duties and the religious worship, like Ezra would have been.
Right.
Zerubbabel, of course, is the tribe of Judah. And no, there was no king. The Jews would never have a king again, as far as an earthly king. They would never have an earthly king again. There were different leaderships. We don't think of Zerubbabel as a prophet,
no.
although I wouldn't come anyone who speaks for God.
It-
For God, as far as in that time, would have been a prophet, even if we didn't call him that.
Right.
I would have considered Ezra a prophet, even though he was a Levite. We just don't. Sometimes we say that certain people are prophets and other people are not. A prophet was one who proclaimed the word of God directly from God.
Right.
So if they had the word of the Lord from the Lord, they were a prophet, whether we called them or not. Was it formalized leadership? I would have said Zerubbabel would have been formalized, but we don't see that chain of command. All right, you go from one king to the next, or one prophet to the next, like we sometimes read of Kings and Chronicles. But and that is part of the reason why Israel can get into trouble when you have no leadership or weak leadership or bad leadership.
Right.
You run into those problems.
Right. That's true. But like you say, certainly Zerubbabel, was capable of directing them, was faithful. Wasn't like they would be without any direction. And whether
and they ran into some part of their problems was they were running into opposition from peoples and other things that they didn't have maybe strong enough leadership at those times to withstand it. They different times stop building the temple, stop building the walls.
Right.
Well, they had different prophets. We'll see in the minor prophets. They needed to stir them up. You need to do this in spite of opposition. So we see that too.
Right. And even that you mentioned that question comes up a little later on. But like for Gord, well, they had Haggai and Zechariah. They're those prophets at that time. We kind of touch on them in a minute. So anyways, hopefully that kind of helps with the question. One of the other things that I noticed was it was interesting to note in the first group that was leaving that Cyrus granted the first decree or commission for the captives to be freed. And of course we know that was through the power of God. He moved Cyrus. How he done that, there's lots of thoughts on that. But Cyrus, with his temperament, as we looked at last week, he was a favorable guy. And he wanted to, those that he ruled, he wanted them to be happy. So we see God used him to free the captives. But in the case of Ezra, we see something a little bit different. If you remember, chapter 6 ended with the history that was recorded by Ezra. It ends with Cyrus and Darius as kings. And now in chapter 7, we jump ahead roughly 600 years, or 60 years, 60 years to the reign of Artaxerxes. And we move there from the point where Ezra speaks of history, we move into his eyewitness account of the present time. Okay? And here's where I saw the difference between the two exiles. Here Ezra goes to King Artaxerxes and seeks permission from him and approval from him to begin a return to Jerusalem, where with Zerubbabel, Cyrus grants him that. But we see Ezra, and that kind of shows a bit of courage, I think, too, on Ezra's part. But Ezra's character, to me, stood out there. And shown by his courage tasked the king, the king's reaction to his request and the letter that was given to Ezra shows that the king respected Ezra, respected him and who he was. And he granted him the privilege of returning. So I don't know if anyone else saw anything else in there. That was kind of the only difference that I could see. But we did say last week that sometimes with our different names of our kings and for the same biblical characters and different opinions on the dates of the times that we've been studying, sometimes those differences can cause people to become discouraged in their Bible studies. And then when discouragement overtakes you, you overlook the important things, the things that are simple. We overlook that God has given to us. And it's in this area sometimes that archaeology can lend a helping hand to us. For instance, something was excavated in 1879 from the foundation of the Esagila, I think is the name. It was a temple in Babylon for the god Marduk. We've read of him in the Bible. And that something now lies in the British Museum in London. And I wondered maybe if Naomi may have seen that when she was there. But what that is the Cyrus cylinder. And it's interesting that on this cylinder, Cyrus the Great describes how he and his army ride peacefully into Babylon and conquer it. And what's more interesting is that there's three understandings of the decrees on the cylinder. And I quote here, he says that the political formalization of racial, linguistic, and religious equality, and slaves, and all deported peoples were to be allowed to return home, and all destroyed temples were to be restored. Now, isn't that something? You know, that's exactly what we have recorded in Ezra. Jerry?
It seemed to me that Cyrus did that for all the peoples. We read of it as he did it for Israel. Well, God stirred him up certainly to do that. It wasn't just Israel, though, that got to return, it seemed, according to what you just read.
Right.
Which I did not know.
Yeah, no, I found that interesting.
But God would use Cyrus for that purpose. And we just have Israel because that's what the Bible's focusing on.
Right.
It's not focusing on those other nations.
Right. Like the Lydian nation. Maybe those people were allowed to go back. Which wouldn't surprise me, because what I did read of Cyrus was he really was concerned about the populace, those that he overtook. He didn't want no kind of unrest with the people that he was ruling over. He wanted them happy. So whatever they chose to follow, then he allowed that. But they still were under his rule, which kind of there was a thought I had too, you know, of us as Christians, and we're told to obey our governments when it's in matters that go against what God says. Of course, we are to take our stand, whether we suffer or not. But I noticed that with Ezra, and we'll see with Nehemiah, they went to the kings of their land, always seeking permission of what they could do. Because now we see Cyrus, the Medo-Persian empire now, rules at all of Asia. And so when you were living in there, you needed to live under his rule. You needed to seek, their permission, such as Ezra did, and Nehemiah did, and they were governors. Nehemiah actually was in the Persian government. But we see that what impressed me was they were godly men and living under God's direction, setting a faithful example, and they were also living within and under their government rule, which just kind of impressed upon me that, we can do the same in areas, though, that, of course, that go along with God's teaching. But I just found them to be kind of a couple of good examples of that. And so we move then from the return of the remnant to the rebuilding of the temple. And of course here we're reminded again of the artist's rendition of the glorious temple that Solomon built for Jehovah, that the faithful so longed for. Remember, we read some passages in Psalms where those that were living in captivity in Babylon longed to be back home, to be in Jerusalem. They longed for this temple to be where God was with them. And so when we think of that, we're asked the question, why does the decree of Cyrus so instrumental in bringing about the rebuilding of the temple, according to the following passages? In Ezra 1, and we just kind of talked a little bit about this, but the first chapter, Ezra 1 to 11, when we read there of Cyrus, king of Persia, how was he instrumental in bringing about the return and the rebuilding of the temple? Would be more so the rebuilding. Lord?
Well, verse 2 says, "Thus says Cyrus the king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has charged me to build in my house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah."
Okay. And what did he do then after he realized that that was his responsibility? What are some of the things that he did? Well, first of all, right, he gave them their freedom, didn't he, to leave and return. And then also, we mentioned this in a few lessons ago, what else did he do for them? Okay, yeah.
And he gave them back what Nebuchadnezzar took from them that they had.
Exactly, Jeremy, yeah. That was the last thing. He returned to them all the gold and silver articles that were taken from the temple by Nebuchadnezzar, which I recall when I read that, I was kind of impressed with him.
This is a completely side note, and I'm not wanting to take you too far. Notice what was not here, though. Nebuchadnezzar seemingly didn't take the Ark of the Covenant because it wasn't there.
Right.
We don't read of the Ark of the Covenant after much after David put it in the temple. And how many times the temple ransacked? If you read all the way through Kings, the gold of the temple and was taken up, put down, and like as far as things went, and the Ark of the Covenant wasn't there. That was one of the things that were missing, because we do not read of it in the New Testament at all.
Right.
And so that was one of the things that was missing, which was just interesting in passing.
That's a good point. We don't know what happened to it, do we?
It's top men. Of it. You've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah,
Top men.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And it's something that plagues mankind. Everybody is trying to find the ark. I think they've found it. And that goes for Noah's Ark also.
Well, yes,
Yeah. But that's true. We have no idea what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. But with what Cyrus did here is pretty impressive, the Gentile king. And just returning all that gold and silver, the articles that Nebuchadnezzar took kind of impressed me. Because as a king, that's part of your power. all that riches, gold and silver. And then to have to part with that sometimes be a tough thing, but we see Cyrus does that. And then under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Jeshua, they set themselves to the task. And we see now that they're back home, and in chapter 3 and verse 7, we read here, I'll just maybe read a couple of these passages. This is now, we're back in Jerusalem, and we read in verse 6, from the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. But the foundation of the temple of the Lord had not been laid. So then, we read, then they gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food, drink, and oil to the Sidonians and to the Tyranians, to bring cedar wood from Lebanon to the Sea of Joppa, according to the permission that they had from Cyrus, king of Persia. That's kind of just that thought I had of the government. They still have to seek permission for everything that they do, but God has granted that to them. And then if you look over in chapter 8, verses 10 to 11. Oh, that's just the sons. I put down the wrong. I put down the wrong chapter. I'm sorry.
What are you looking for?
Eh?
What are you looking for?
It was just thoughts of Zerubbabel and Jeshua when they started the project. It might have been chapter.
I'm looking at 6 in case you look.
Yeah, I've lost. Let me check chapter 4 here. I don't want to pull us down. Well, chapter 4, verses 1 to 5 is where, I've put the wrong chapter down for my second thought there. But now we've moved along. The foundation hasn't been laid, and they have begun now. And they've laid the foundation of the temple. Maybe it was chapter 3 that I might have been after. But anyways, we see now in chapter 4, verses 1 to 5, now we see we have enemies coming into the scene here. They hear that the people are rebuilding a temple to the Lord God of Israel. And we see in verse 2 that they approach Zerubbabel, and they want to help build the temple. And what happens there? What is Zerubbabel's reaction to that?
Oh.
Right, Jeremy. In verse 3, Zerubbabel says, you have nothing in common with us in building a house to our God, but we ourselves will together build to the Lord God of Israel. And then again he mentions King Cyrus, the permission that he has. Jeremy?
And this is the foundation for understanding this relationship. The foundation for understanding all of the animosity that the Jews had with the Samaritans. These two peoples would hate each other for 500 years till the time of Christ. Understanding the parable of the Good Samaritan, understanding the Jews' reactions to Samaritans in general in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John starts here.
Right.
And these were the people that the Assyrians placed in there when Israel was taken captive, even before Judah was by Nebuchadnezzar. And so these people weren't regarded as Jews and weren't treated as Jews either.
Right, right. That's true, and we see it beginning here. And just in this time period, now if you look over in chapter 5, verses 3 and 5, Zerubbabel just took care of those people. And now in chapter 5, we see a governor Tatanea. Oh, anybody got a? That's a
Tatnai, probably.
yeah, another tough one. But we see here that he comes and he causes problems, and he's trying to seek out who issued. He said to the prophets, he says, "Who issued you a decree to rebuild this temple and to finish this structure?" As if it had anything to do with him anyway. But we just see that they're constantly plagued. And then we see that King Darius at this time, now he's helping out the remnant also. And you see over in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, when he hears about this, he issues a decree, and a search was made in the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon. So he searches out, and he finds out that King Cyrus granted the Jews this privilege. And so he takes care of the situation. He writes a letter to this governor, and he replies to him, telling him that they are able to build, they are allowed to build. So we just kind of see God's overlooking of this whole operation, watching over Israel. Things were being taken care of with the help even of the Gentile kings at that time, which I just thought was, we see God's hand, don't we, in it. And then moving along in the content, we see Zechariah and Haggai. And we're asked here, how did the work of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah affect the rebuilding of the temple? First, if I ask you this question, have you ever put together plans for a project? Like even the girls, no matter what kind of project it was, no matter the size of it, how do you feel in the beginning when you put these plans together? Right, Jerry, motivated, excited. But then, as time goes on, problems arise. But the captives, they felt the same. They started the temple 2 months after they returned. After they had, traveled back, left captivity, they had preparations. They had the foundation laid in 2 months. And the foundation was built in no time, but then the work stalled. And it was discontinued for 14 years. It stopped. They built it in 2 months, the foundation, and then things stopped for 14 years. And why did that stop? Jeremy kind of touched on it. But
they faced opposition, they lost heart, got involved in other things. Like as far as when we do something, we start off something, we'll really do it, and then, all right, we get sidetracked here, something happens here, something happens we didn't expect, or something happens to discourage us, and we stop. And even when Darius gives them permission again, well, we've not been doing it for so long, it's hard to get back in the rhythm of doing it.
Right.
And so, lots of those reasons.
Exactly. And we see then in chapter 5, verses 1 to 2, we meet 2 characters there. Maybe Naomi, do you want to read that for us, please?
Now the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the sons of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who is over them. Then Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jezodak arose and began to rebuild the house of God that is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them supporting them. Okay,
someone has to get them tough names. Yeah. But we see there the last few words that Naomi read. The prophets were what? What were they doing with the people?
Encouraging them, they were helping them, they were moving them along.
Right, they were supporting them, they were standing behind them. And what do you think they might have said to them? If you turn over to Haggai, the book of Haggai, Zephaniah, Haggai, Nahum, oh sorry, right. Nahum, Zephaniah, and Haggai. But Haggai chapter 1, verses 3 to 9. Maybe 3 to 9. We'll start. Erie, do you want to read a couple verses and we'll move along to the end of verse 9?
Sure. Then the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it then time for you yourself to dwell in the paneled house, in this temple like ruins?
Now therefore, thus saith the Lord, consider your ways. You have so much to bring in you eat, but do not have enough. You bring, but you are not filled with grain. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earn wages according to a bag with gold. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the mountains and bring food, and build a temple that I may take pleasure in it and be glorified, saith the Lord.
In verse 9.
You looked so much, and behold, it came little, and when you brought it full, I blew it away. Right. There's the Lord of hosts. Because of my house that lies in ruins, while each of you busies himself with his own house.
Okay, we see Haggai's pretty blunt here, isn't he? Challenges Israel. But sometimes we need to hear these words, don't we? We don't like to be corrected a lot of times, but it is for our good. And then we see, then after what Haggai says to them, look at verse 14, and we see the results of that. And remember, it takes courage. You think of these prophets, maybe Isaiah mostly, but prophets didn't have an easy job. They had to take a stand in correction. And that's not easy. But then we see after Haggai does this, we see verse 14. So the Lord stirred up the spirit also of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. I think that should have been Jeshua. But
Joshua's the same.
yeah, that's true. You're right. And the spirit of all the remnant of the people. And then we see the results of all this. And they came and worked on the house of the Lord of hosts, their God. The words of encouragement, correction, motivated them, and things, again, get moving along. And so we move on then to the last content, and of course that's the work of Ezra. And we're asked how long after the completion of the temple did Ezra actually arrive in Jerusalem. Remember, the temple's built now. And Ezra, he picks up his bags and he moves from Babylon back to Jerusalem. But it's, like, was it within a month or two after completion that he came back? Can anyone remember?
They're not like 7 years or something.
Yeah, well, yeah, I found 58 years.
Is it in the text? Are you going off something else? I was looking.
Chapter 7, verse 7, Corey?
Well, I was in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, the king. So then you have to figure out when that was. But
Right.
Darius, it was the 24th year of Darius, according to Haggai, that they began building the temple again. And so there are other kings involved. This is another king after Darius. And whether this Artaxerxes is the immediate king after Darius, or whether he's actually probably after Esther, this king, only the kings that were notable, again, were mentioned. If there was a king in between, or the number is 57.
Is it? Oh, okay.
Agree if you agree with
With Naomi's,
with Naomi's history.
Yeah. Well,
Or yours history.
I have 58, so I'll go along with Naomi's history then. But the point is, it was quite a while afterwards, But Ezra now is an interesting character. We see in chapter 7 and verse 10, Ezra has set his heart upon something, and that is to study the law of the Lord and to practice it, and to teach his statutes and ordinances in Israel. Ezra was an upright man. He was a priest in the lineage of Aaron. Remember, we looked at that, in the line of Aaron, as well as a skilled scribe in the law of Moses. Scribes were a special devoted breed of men. I was talking to Jeremy about this morning when we came in. I had read in Zayre's commentary the qualifications of a scribe and how they were to copy. They were to change nothing. And as we had said, not even a punctuation, a jot or a tittle. Nothing was to be changed. And those men stuck to it. Zayre even makes the point, Jesus really never placed any woes upon them. They were honorable men, and this is how Ezra is described. And then in chapter 7, we see that Artaxerxes has granted Ezra permission to lead his people, and he has provided a letter of conveyance and offered to provide whatever materials that he may need for the temple from the king's royal treasure. We read that in chapter 7, verse 12 to 28. Again, just the thought of how God used other kings to help out Israel in his efforts to take them back home. And then we'll end with this. We see here that Ezra now has been granted permission. He's gathered his brethren together, and they are now camped at the river that runs to Havaba, I think is how you pronounce that. But if you turn over to chapter 8, we see there that Ezra now is gathered at this river. He's making final preparations. And in verse 21 to 23. Lisa, do you want to read 21 and then Sandra maybe 22 and 23? Please. Chapter 8. Ezra chapter 8. Is that 21, sorry?
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8, verse 21. Okay, just the point there is, here is the man leaving. the people. And look at his attitude that he's teaching them. He's telling them to humble yourselves in front of God. And he was ashamed. He said to ask the king for help. Let us ask our God. Just some thoughts on Ezra's attitude. Okay, I guess we'll end there. Thank you.